The security badge slipped from Marcus's trembling fingers and hit the concrete like a gunshot. For a second, no one moved. The port of Charleston buzzed behind him with its usual metallic rhythm, cranes screeching, containers slamming into place, cargo ships groaning against the dock, but in Marcus's chest, everything had gone silent. 10 years of grease-stained mornings. 10 years of crawling beneath engines while other men clocked out early. 10 years of holding a broken world together with a wrench and a prayer. Gone in a single meeting that lasted less than 5 minutes. They said budget cuts. They said restructuring. They said nothing personal. But it felt personal. Because when you're the only mechanic who never calls in sick, the only one who works double shifts without complaint, the only single father trying to keep a roof over your son's head, it always feels personal. Marcus bent down and picked up the badge, staring at the faded photo of a younger version of himself, hopeful, unbroken. He thought about Ryan waiting at school, probably telling his friends how his dad could fix anything. He thought about the rent due in 12 days. He thought about the stack of medical bills from when Ryan had broken his arm last fall. What would you do if this were you? If everything you built with your bare hands was taken without warning? Would you beg? Would you scream? Or would you swallow the humiliation because your child needed you strong? Marcus chose silence. He always did. He walked across the dock one last time, passing the cranes he'd repaired during hurricane season, the trucks he'd kept running through brutal summers, the engines he'd coaxed back to life when no one else could. Some of the younger workers avoided his eyes. A few offered stiff nods. No one stepped forward. He placed his toolbox into the back of his rusted Ford pickup, the metal clanking like a closing door. Then the sky began to tremble. At first it was faint, a distant thudding, like thunder rolling over the Atlantic. Workers looked up, shading their eyes against the sun. The sound grew louder, sharper, slicing through the air until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. 3 dark shapes appeared over the horizon. Naval helicopters. They cut across the blue sky in tight formation, descending with deliberate precision toward the port. Dust and debris whipped into spirals as they lowered, rotors churning the air into chaos. Marcus froze beside his truck, confusion knitting his brow. The helicopters bore the unmistakable markings of the United States Navy. What on earth were they doing here? The machines landed hard on the open concrete, wind blasting against stacked containers. Doors slid open. Uniformed officers stepped out with urgency in their movements. Workers scattered, whispering, staring. Even the port manager, Harold Bennett, rushed forward, his polished shoes scraping against grit. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Surely this wasn't about him. He was nobody. Just a mechanic they decided was too expensive to keep. But then one of the officers, a tall man with streaks of gray at his temples, scanned the area and called out a name that made Marcus's heart nearly stop. They were looking for him. The port had received an emergency call less than an hour earlier. A Navy transport vessel, docked offshore for classified cargo transfer, had suffered catastrophic engine failure. The onboard systems had locked up. Digital diagnostics failed. Remote specialists couldn't fix it. Replacement parts would take days. And the vessel couldn't remain stranded, not with sensitive equipment on board and a storm system forming miles out at sea. Someone had told them about a mechanic in Charleston who didn't rely on computer readouts. Someone who could listen to an engine and hear its secrets. Marcus Hayes. The man they had just fired. Harold Bennett's face drained of color as he realized what had happened. He stammered explanations, talked about staffing changes, about miscommunications. But the Navy officer wasn't interested in excuses. They needed Marcus. And suddenly, the man who had been disposable 30 minutes earlier stood at the center of a crisis that no one else could solve. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest. Not at the Navy. Not at the officers who looked at him with respect instead of dismissal. But at the irony. at the humiliation of being unwanted one moment and essential the next. He thought about saying no. He imagined driving away, picking up Ryan from school, telling him they'd figure something out. Let the port deal with its consequences. Let Harold explain to Washington why they'd let go of the only man who could fix what was broken. Would you have refused? Would pride have guided you? Or responsibility? Marcus looked at the helicopters, then at his truck. He imagined Ryan's small hands gripping his backpack straps, trusting his father to make things okay. He nodded. They flew him out immediately. From the air, the port looked smaller, less powerful. The ocean stretched endlessly, steel gray beneath the afternoon sun. When they landed on the deck of the stranded vessel, tension hung thick as smoke. Sailors moved quickly, faces tight with worry. Marcus stepped into the engine room and the world narrowed to sound and vibration. He didn't need a laptop. He didn't need diagnostics. He ran his hand along the metal casing, feeling the heat patterns. He closed his eyes and listened to the uneven rhythm of a wounded machine gasping for stability. He crawled into tight spaces no officer would dare enter. Grease stained his shirt. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Hours passed. Above deck, clouds gathered on the horizon. Below, Marcus worked with the quiet desperation of a father who couldn't afford failure. He thought about the nights he'd stayed up helping Ryan with math homework, pretending he wasn't exhausted. He thought about the mornings he'd skipped breakfast so his son wouldn't notice the fridge was nearly empty. He thought about every sacrifice that had gone unseen. He tightened one final bolt. There was a pause. Then the engine roared to life, smooth and steady, like it had never faltered. The vibration shifted from chaos to harmony. Cheers erupted through the steel corridors. Sailors clapped him on the back. The commanding officer gripped his grease-covered hand with gratitude that felt genuine. When Marcus stepped back onto the dock hours later, the storm clouds had passed. The helicopters lifted off once more, mission secured. But this time, the port felt different. Harold Bennett approached him slowly, pride replaced by something closer to shame. Word had already spread. Workers who had avoided Marcus's eyes earlier now looked at him with awe. They offered him his job back, of course. With a raise. With apologies. With promises of respect. Marcus listened quietly. Then he said he would return on one condition. That every mechanic under him would receive proper training. That layoffs would never again target the most dedicated simply because they were quiet. That loyalty would mean something. For the first time, Harold agreed without argument. That evening, Marcus picked up Ryan from school. The boy ran into his arms, unaware of how close their world had come to cracking apart. Marcus held him tighter than usual, breathing in the scent of sunscreen and childhood. He realized something profound. Sometimes the world fires you to remind you of your worth. Sometimes humiliation clears the stage for recognition. And sometimes, when helicopters land 30 minutes after you lose everything, it's not just about engines. It's about dignity. Before this story ends, tell me in the comments what you would have done in Marcus's place. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that quiet strength still matters in a noisy world, please like, comment, share, and subscribe only if it truly touched your heart.